It was just before dawn on June 6, 1944. The sea off the coast of Normandy churned with grey, angry waves, and the air was thick with salt, fear, and anticipation. For miles in every direction, the water seemed alive, hundreds upon hundreds of ships. Their silhouettes ghostly in the pre-dawn mist, engines humming, men silent. They called it Operation Neptune, the naval arm of a larger plan called Overlord. But the men on those landing craft, the boys clutching rifles slick with sweat and sea spray, didn't think in terms of code names. For them, it was just D-Day, the day they'd either live forever in history or die trying. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And if you love stories like this, true, human, raw tales from the heart of World War II, hit that like button and share this video with a friend who appreciates history. It helps us bring you more of these forgotten stories that deserve to be remembered. Now, let's go back to that morning, a morning that would change the world. Imagine it. Cold, restless, a rolling sheet of steel under the dark sky. It's 2 a.m. The invasion fleet, over 5,000 vessels strong, is on the move. It's the largest armada ever assembled in human history. Battleships, destroyers, landing craft, minesweepers, transports, they stretch as far as the eye can see. In their bellies, 156,000 Allied soldiers wait, their faces pale under dim red lights, their gear clanking softly with every sway of the sea. Some pray, some smoke, some stare blankly into the dark, lost in thought. The air smells of diesel, oil, and salt, and under it all, fear. Not panic, not chaos, just a deep, quiet awareness of what's coming. Many of these men are barely 20 years old. Some are veterans of Sicily and North Africa. Most are green. They've trained for months in England, climbing rope nets, storming mock beaches, memorizing maps of French coastlines drawn from reconnaissance photos. But no amount of training prepares a man for war like this dot at 3 a.m. The first waves of C-47 transport aircraft drone overhead, heading toward the French mainland. Inside them, paratroopers, the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with their British counterparts of the 6th Airborne. Their mission: to drop behind enemy lines, capture key bridges, secure the flanks, and sow chaos before the beach landings begin. The night sky bursts with anti-aircraft fire as they cross the coastline. Tracers streak past the aircraft windows like fiery needles. Some planes are hit. Some burst into flames. Others drop their sticks of paratroopers too early or too late. Men are scattered across miles of countryside, some landing in hedgerows, others in flooded fields. Even in rivers, many drown before they even hit the ground. But somehow, amidst the confusion, small groups form, rallying under fire, capturing towns, sabotaging German reinforcements. The paratroopers' chaos becomes an advantage. The Germans can't tell how many have landed or where. Back at sea, it's almost dawn. The men in the landing craft can see flashes on the horizon now. The distant bombardment from Allied battleships pounding the French coast. The USS Texas, the HMS Warspite, the USS Nevada, all unleashing hell on Hitler's Atlantic War. Concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, radar stations. Targets are lit up and obliterated. Or at least that's the hope. But not everything goes to plan. Offshore, the waves are rougher than predicted. Many landing craft drift off course. The tide is stronger, the wind harsher. And then there's the element of surprise, or rather, the lack of it. The Germans knew something was coming. The question had been where. They'd built their fortifications along the coast from Norway to the Spanish border. Thousands of concrete bunkers, minefields, and obstacles designed to shred any invading force. For months, Allied deception operations had tried to convince them the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point. Operation Fortitude, they called it. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, even a phantom general, George S. Patton, leading a non-existent army. And it worked, mostly, but not everywhere. At Normandy, German defenses were still strong and manned by experienced troops. The first light creeps over the horizon. It's 5:30 a.m. On the decks of the landing craft, the men are told 30 minutes. Some nod silently, others vomit from nerves and motion sickness. A few crack jokes, desperate to hold onto something normal. The officers pace, rehearsing in their heads. Keep moving. Don't stop on the beach. Get to cover. Then the naval guns fall silent. The air is eerily still. And in that brief, terrible quiet, every man feels the weight of history pressing down. Then, suddenly, the sky explodes. German coastal guns open fire. Shells whistle overhead and crash into the sea. Geysers of water erupting among the landing craft. Some are hit directly, torn apart. Others capsize. The men keep going. They have no choice. The ramps lower, and hell begins. At Omaha Beach, the worst of it unfolds. The tide is low, exposing 300 yards of open sand between the waterline and the first cover. German machine guns, hidden in bunkers, rake the beach with deadly precision. The first waves of Americans are cut down before they can even take a step. Men dive into the shallow surf, trying to find shelter behind metal obstacles. Check hedgehogs. Wooden stakes tipped with mines. The water turns red. Medics crawl through the chaos, dragging the wounded out, often dying beside them. The beachmasters, the officers tasked with organizing the chaos, are shouting, waving, sometimes firing their pistols in the air to rally the men. Get off the beach. Move up. But how do you move through a wall of lead? Some soldiers play dead. Others crawl, inch by inch. A few brave souls sprint, miraculously making it to the seawall. Engineers blow gaps through the obstacles with Bangalore torpedoes. Slowly, painfully, the tide begins to turn. Up above, P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons dive bomb German positions. The sky roars with engines. A squadron of RAF Spitfires provides cover, while B-26 Marauders drop bombs on the inland defenses. Not all hit their mark. Some fall short, adding to the chaos below. But the psychological impact is immense. German defenders begin to falter. Some run low on ammunition. Others retreat inland. Further east, on Sword, Juno, and gold beaches. The British and Canadians fare slightly better. They to face fierce resistance, machine gun nests, artillery, minefields, but their armored support arrives sooner. By mid-morning, they've pushed several kilometers inland, capturing villages and crossroads. The Canadians at Juno fight with ferocious determination, taking heavy casualties but refusing to stop. The British 3rd Division, landing on Sword, secure the crucial town of Wistreham and move to link up with paratroopers holding Pegasus Bridge, one of the most daring airborne captures of the war. At Utah Beach. On the western flank, things go differently. The first waves of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division land nearly 2,000 yards off target, thanks to strong currents. But in a twist of fate, this mistake saves lives. The sector they land in is less heavily defended. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., yes, the son of the former president, is among the first ashore. He famously looks around, realizes they're in the wrong spot, and says calmly, "We'll start the war from right here." His decision to push inland instead of trying to correct course is credited with the quick success at Utah. By noon, the beaches are littered with wreckage, burned out landing craft, destroyed tanks, bodies of men and horses, tangled wire. The smell of smoke and cordite hangs thick in the air. And yet, against all odds, the Allies have done it. They have a foothold. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's impenetrable barrier, has been breached. But the victory came at a cost. On D-Day alone, Allied forces suffered around 10,000 casualties, with more than 4,000 confirmed dead. Many of them never made it off the sand. Their names are carved today into white crosses overlooking the sea, silent witnesses to the price of freedom. Still, for those who survived, the day wasn't over. Inland, the fighting was fierce. The Bocage, Normandy's infamous hedgerows, became a nightmare for advancing troops. Tanks couldn't see past the high earthen walls. German snipers and machine gunners used them like fortresses, ambushing every step forward. The first week after D-Day was as bloody as the landings themselves. Every field, every farmhouse was a battle. But momentum was now with the Allies. Reinforcements poured in: men, vehicles, supplies. Within days, an artificial harbor called Mulberry had been constructed off the beaches, a staggering feat of engineering. Massive concrete caissons, towed from England, were sunk to form breakwaters. Floating piers allowed ships to unload tanks and trucks directly onto the shore. In less than a week, Normandy became the busiest port in Europe. And behind it all, the skies belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe, once feared, was nowhere to be seen. Months of relentless bombing had crippled Germany's air power. Now, Allied fighter bombers ruled the skies, strafing German convoys, blowing up bridges, cutting off reinforcements. It wasn't just an invasion. It was a machine, planned, coordinated, relentless. The Germans, for their part, were stunned. Hitler himself slept through the first hours of the invasion, convinced it was a feint. When he finally gave the order to counterattack, it was too late. His best armored divisions, the feared panzer units, were still held back, waiting for the real invasion at Calais. By the time they moved, the beaches were secure. Still, the fight was far from over. The Battle of Normandy would drag on for 2 brutal months. Towns like Caen, Saint-Lô, and Carentan would be reduced to rubble. The Allied advance would be measured in yards, not miles. But the beachhead, that fragile toehold, would hold. From it, the liberation of France would begin, and eventually, the march to Berlin. And think about this. The entire operation hinged on a single day of weather. Just one. The invasion was originally set for June 5th. But heavy storms forced General Eisenhower to delay. His meteorologists predicted a brief break in the weather the next morning. A narrow window of calmer seas and clearer skies. Eisenhower took the gamble. Had he waited longer, the next opportunity might have been weeks away. And by then, the Germans would have strengthened their defenses. One decision, one gut call, changed the course of history. It's easy to look back now and see it as inevitable. D-Day, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But to the men there, it didn't feel inevitable. It felt impossible. Each man on those beaches carried not just a rifle, but the weight of the free world on his shoulders. And somehow, through courage, chaos, and sheer willpower, they held the line. Before we move further into how those first 24 hours reshaped the war, from the perspectives of the pilots above, the commanders on ships, and the soldiers on the ground, take a second to subscribe if you haven't yet. Drop a like if this part moved you. And tell me in the comments which story from D-Day you want to hear in depth. The paratroopers, the medics, or the men who stormed Omaha. And share this with someone who needs to remember what courage really looked like. By the evening of June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were no longer just sand and surf. They were graveyards, supply dumps, and footholds all at once. The smoke still hung low, drifting inland, a reminder of the inferno that had raged since dawn. The sea, once dark and violent, was now littered with the debris of war. Burned-out tanks half submerged in the tide, crates of ammunition bobbing in the waves, and the bodies of men who had crossed an ocean and fallen within sight of France. But even as dusk fell, the work didn't stop. Engineers, medics, officers, everyone had a job. Bulldozers roared through the night, clearing wreckage and pushing up ramps for vehicles. Radios crackled with confusion, half in code, half in shouts. On the ships offshore, reinforcements were being loaded, supplies were being transferred, and chaplains prayed over the wounded. The invasion had succeeded in getting ashore, yes, but it was far from secure. The truth is, the Allies had expected to capture certain objectives by the end of the first day. The city of Caen, for example. But the reality on the ground was slower, bloodier, and far more chaotic. Caen, held by the experienced 21st Panzer Division, would not fall for weeks. The bocage, those damned hedgerows, made every advance a nightmare. They were ancient, earthen barriers covered in thick vegetation, some older than the Roman Empire. Tanks couldn't see through them. Infantry couldn't move quickly over them. German snipers used them like personal fortresses, vanishing after every shot. I remember once talking to an old veteran, a weary fellow from the 29th Infantry Division. He told me the hedgerows were worse than the beach. At least on Omaha, he said, You could see where the bullets were coming from. In the bocage, death had no direction. You'd hear a crack, someone would fall, and the bushes would just whisper like nothing happened. The Germans fought like wolves in that terrain. Units of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS launched counterattacks again and again, trying to push the Allies back into the sea. They failed each time, but not without cost. The Allies bled for every hedgerow, every farmhouse, every damned ditch. The first 10 days after D-Day saw some of the fiercest close-quarters fighting of the war. And yet, amidst the carnage, small miracles happened. Supply officers established makeshift depots just off the beach. Medics turned barns into field hospitals. Farmers who'd hidden through the bombardment crept out of their cellars with white flags, offering milk and bread to soldiers who hadn't eaten in days. There's one story from a Canadian unit that always stuck with me. They captured a small village outside Courseulles-sur-Mer, and inside a bombed-out house they found a table still set for dinner. Wine glasses half full, bread on the plates. The family had fled just minutes before the shelling began. One soldier, barely 19, took off his helmet and said quietly, "Let's win this fast, so they can come home." Behind the beaches, the logistical genius of the invasion began to show. The mulberry harbors, those enormous artificial ports, were now being assembled at breakneck speed. Imagine it, whole sections of floating roadways, steel pontoons, and concrete breakwaters, each the size of a building, towed across the channel and anchored in place. Within 48 hours, trucks were rolling ashore in a steady stream. Fuel, ammunition, rations, everything needed to keep an army moving. Without those harbors, Normandy might have starved before it could advance. Then there was Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. Few people talk about it today, but it was one of the war's quiet marvels. Engineers laid flexible pipelines from England to the French coast, carrying fuel directly under the sea. It sounds mad, but it worked. It kept tanks, jeeps, and aircraft fueled as the advance pushed deeper into France. Meanwhile, the air war raged above. Allied air supremacy was absolute. The RAF and the USAAF flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day alone, and thousands more in the days after. The Luftwaffe barely appeared, its ranks decimated by years of attrition. But the skies were far from peaceful. Pilots had to navigate thick clouds of smoke, friendly fire, and the chaos of ground coordination. And yet, their presence made the difference. Every German convoy moving by day risked being annihilated from above. Bridges were blown apart, rail lines shattered, reinforcements delayed. The Luftwaffe pilots who did rise to meet them, those few left, faced overwhelming odds. One of those Allied pilots, a young man named Jack Reynolds from Iowa, flew AP-47 Thunderbolt on June 7th. He wrote in his logbook later, "We flew over the beaches just after sunrise. Smoke was still rising from the wrecks. You could see the ships offshore like toys in a bathtub. And below us, the whole coast of France, crawling with men. I thought to myself, we really did it. We got in. Now we just have to survive long enough to make it mean something." Survival, though, was far from guaranteed. The Germans launched their first major counterattack on June 7th near Com. Tanks from the 21st Panzer Division struck hard against British positions near Sword Beach. It was nearly a disaster. They punched a hole through the line, even reached the coast for a brief moment, threatening to cut the British forces in two. But naval gunfire saved the day. Battleships offshore rained shells down with pinpoint accuracy, obliterating the counterattack before it could gain traction. The message was clear. The beachhead would not be given up. In the days that followed, the weather turned sour again. High winds battered the coast, making resupply difficult. One of the Mulberry harbors, at Omaha, was destroyed by a violent storm on June 19th. But by then, the Allies had already moved enough supplies inland to sustain themselves. The other harbor, at Aromanches, survived and would handle the weight of the entire Allied logistics network for weeks to come. Every day, more ships arrived. Every night, more men landed. And with them came something else: hope. The French resistance, hearing the news of the invasion, rose up across the country. They sabotaged train lines, ambushed German convoys, sent intelligence to Allied command. Eisenhower's gamble was paying off. The Germans were stretched thin, confused, and increasingly desperate. Still, the battle for Normandy was turning into a slog. Caen, the key to the eastern flank, became a fortress. The Germans turned every street into a trap, every ruin into a bunker. British and Canadian forces bombarded it repeatedly, but the rubble only made defense easier for the Germans. It took until mid-July for the city to finally fall. And even then, the price was high: thousands of civilian deaths. Whole neighborhoods reduced to dust. To the west, the Americans were fighting their own war, one of hedgerows, ambushes, and attrition. It was General Omar Bradley's job to break out of the beachhead. His troops had been advancing inch by inch for weeks, pleading for ground that barely mattered. Then came Operation Cobra, the plan that would finally shatter the German lines. Cobra began on July 25th with an air bombardment unlike anything seen before. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, dropped more than 3,000 tons of explosives on a narrow section of the German front. The earth shook. Men miles away felt the ground tremble. The sky went black with smoke and dust. When it cleared, the German defenses were gone, and the Americans poured through the breach. It wasn't clean. It wasn't easy, but it worked. Within days, Allied forces were racing across open countryside. The German army, caught between two fronts and low on fuel, began to collapse. By early August, the Allies had captured Avranches, opening the way south into Brittany and east toward Paris. The breakout had begun. All of it, every inch of progress, traced back to those men who'd stepped off the landing craft on June 6th. The beachhead had held, and now the flood was unstoppable. The myth of the Atlantic Wall was broken. Hitler's empire was cracking piece by piece. And yet, D-Day wasn't just a military victory. It was a human one. It was about ordinary men doing something extraordinary. Men like Private John Steele, the paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne who got his parachute caught on the church steeple in St. Mire-Église and hung there for hours, pretending to be dead while the battle raged below. or the medics who set up triage centers right on the sand, using helmets as basins and morphine as their only mercy, or the sailors who piloted their landing craft back and forth under fire, over and over, to bring more men ashore. You talk to the survivors, and most don't call themselves heroes. They'll tell you they were scared out of their minds. They'll tell you they just did what needed to be done. And that humility, that quiet, matter-of-fact courage, is what makes D-Day such a powerful story even now, 80 years later. Because it wasn't just about armies. It was about humanity holding its breath and then leaping into the unknown. The success of the landings didn't come from luck alone. It came from planning, sacrifice, and sheer stubborn will. The planners of Operation Overlord, men like Eisenhower, Montgomery, Ramsey, and Lee Mallory, had spent years preparing. Every detail, from the tides to the moonlight, was calculated. Every soldier, from the highest general to the lowest private, was part of a vast, interlocking puzzle. And yet, when the moment came, it all depended on individuals, on courage in the face of terror. And perhaps that's why D-Day still resonates today. It reminds us that history isn't made by grand speeches or perfect plans. It's made by people, scared, flawed, determined people, doing their duty when everything seems lost. If you're still here listening, take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button if this story's pulling you in, and share it with someone who'd want to feel what those men felt. The fear, the hope, the grit of it all. And tell me in the comments, if you could speak to one D-Day veteran, what would you ask him? By late July, the beaches of Normandy no longer looked like beaches. They were sprawling ports, bustling with movement. The sand that once ran red with blood was now churned by truck tires and tank treads. Rows of tents stretched inland. Field kitchens smoked through the mornings. And the constant thunder of artillery rolled over the fields like a heartbeat. The invasion had become a living organism, breathing, growing, consuming everything in its path. But there was a problem. The Allies were still trapped in a narrow strip of land. They had the numbers, the firepower, the air superiority, but the terrain was strangling them. The Bocage country was relentless, and every attempt to push deeper into France was met with fierce, organized German resistance. Eisenhower's command was under pressure. The world expected the Allies to be sweeping through France by now, but progress was agonizingly slow. Even Churchill grumbled in frustration, saying the advance was measured in yards, not miles. Then came Operation Cobra, the hammer blow that would break the stalemate. It began on the morning of July 25, 1944. With the earth-shaking bombardment I mentioned earlier. Thousands of tons of bombs fell on a narrow sector near Saint-Lô, pulverizing the German front lines. Some American units were caught in their own bombing due to miscommunication. A tragic friendly fire incident that killed hundreds. But once the smoke cleared, Bradley's infantry surged forward. The German line was shattered. The breakout was brutal, fast, and decisive. 4 weeks. The Allies had been boxed in. Now they poured through the breach like water through a dam. General George S. Patton, who had been waiting impatiently in England, was finally unleashed. His Third Army roared into France like a hurricane. Patton was a complex man, brilliant, volatile, obsessed with speed and discipline. His tanks and mechanized columns swept through Brittany, capturing towns before the Germans even realized what was happening. It was classic Patton, audacious, reckless, and devastatingly effective. German commanders were in chaos. Field Marshal von Kluge tried to regroup, but his forces were being torn apart by air attacks and supply shortages. The Allies controlled the skies completely. Every road, every bridge, every column of vehicles that dared to move by daylight was hunted by P-47s, Typhoons, and Mustangs. Pilots described the Normandy roads as a shooting gallery. The German army was disintegrating under constant bombardment. Then came the trap, the Falaise Pocket. Patton's forces swept east from Avranches, while the British and Canadians pushed south from Caen. The plan was to encircle the retreating German 7th Army and the remnants of the panzer divisions near the town of Falaise. It was a race, a desperate, furious race to close the gap before the Germans could escape. The fighting in that pocket was apocalyptic. The Germans, realizing they were being encircled, fought like cornered beasts. Entire divisions were annihilated. Tanks lay scattered and burning across the fields. The stench of fuel, blood, and decay was unbearable. Even hardened soldiers were shaken by what they saw. When the gap finally closed on August 21st, tens of thousands of Germans lay dead or captured. The road between Chambois and Falaise was littered with wreckage for miles. A graveyard of the Wehrmacht. Historians later called it the death of the German army in France. And it was. That pocket destroyed Hitler's last chance of holding Western Europe. From then on, the road to Paris lay open. Meanwhile, in the skies above, the air war was changing too. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a ghost. Allied pilots flew with near impunity, strafing convoys, blowing up fuel depots, cutting railway lines. But there was a strange melancholy in their dominance. Many of these airmen had once feared the German aces, names like Galland, Hartmann, and Barkhahn. Now, the skies were almost empty. The thrill of combat had given way to the grim efficiency of destruction. And on the ground, the people of France began to rise. News of the Allied advance spread like wildfire. The resistance, men and women who had lived in shadows for long years, came into the open. They blew up railways, seized weapons, and ambushed retreating Germans. In every village, church bells that had been silent since 1940 began to ring again. The tricolor flag, forbidden for years, reappeared in windows and over town halls. Patton's advance was astonishing. His armored divisions covered hundreds of miles in days, capturing Le Mans, Chartres, and eventually reaching the Seine. Supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Tanks ran dry in the middle of nowhere. To keep them moving, Allied engineers built bridges faster than the maps could be updated. The Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system run largely by African-American drivers, became the lifeline of the army. Those men worked around the clock, under constant danger, hauling fuel and ammunition through the bombed-out countryside. Without them, Patton's army would have stalled. By late August. The German command in France was collapsing. Hitler refused to allow a retreat. issuing orders from his bunker that bore no connection to reality. Many of his commanders ignored him, retreating in disarray. Others stayed and were wiped out. The once mighty Wehrmacht was now a shadow, hungry, exhausted, broken. And then, the liberation of Paris. The French capital had been under German occupation since June 1940. For 4 long years, its people had endured humiliation and fear. The swastika had flown over the Eiffel Tower. German officers had dined in the cafes of the Champs-Élysées, while Parisians whispered of freedom in secret. Now, that long nightmare was about to end. On August 19, 1944, the Paris police, led by the resistance, rose in open rebellion. Barricades went up across the city. Street fighting broke out. The Allies were initially hesitant to divert forces toward Paris. Eisenhower wanted to focus on chasing the retreating Germans. But Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, insisted that Paris must be liberated by the French themselves, not left to burn or fall into chaos. So, on August 24th, elements of the French 2nd Armored Division, under General Leclerc, entered the city. The next day, they were joined by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. Crowds flooded the streets, cheering, weeping, waving flags. Church bells rang across the city for the first time in years. The German garrison surrendered, and on August 25th, de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées in triumph, declaring Paris liberated by her own people, with the help of France's allies. For the men who had stormed the beaches 10 weeks earlier, it felt like vindication. They'd fought through hell to reach this moment. But even amid the celebrations, they knew the war wasn't over. Beyond the Seine, the Germans were regrouping behind the Siegfried Line, the fortified wall along their western border. Ahead lay Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. The road to Berlin was still long and full of blood, still. That summer of 1940 felt like a turning point, not just militarily, but spiritually. The Allies had proven that Hitler's empire could be broken. Europe was waking up from a nightmare. Soldiers who had landed as strangers on a foreign shore now found themselves embraced by the people they had come to free. There were flowers, kisses, tears, and silence for the fallen. I once heard a British veteran describe that march into Paris. He said, "We'd been fighting so long, we almost forgot what peace sounded like. Then suddenly, people were shouting our names, throwing flowers, playing music. It didn't feel real. It felt like a dream someone else was having." But while Paris celebrated, the fighting continued elsewhere. In the north, the Canadians pushed toward the Channel ports. In the south, new Allied landings, Operation Dragoon, struck along the French Riviera, bringing more troops into the fight. The Germans were being squeezed from every direction. Eisenhower's strategy was working, but it came with new challenges. Supply lines were overstretched. Fuel shortages plagued the advancing armies. Patton, who had raced so far ahead, found himself stalled simply because his tanks ran out of gas. The front stretched hundreds of miles, and coordination was increasingly complex. Montgomery wanted to strike directly into Germany through the Netherlands, a bold plan that would become Operation Market Garden. Patton wanted to push through Lorraine. Eisenhower had to balance ambition with logistics, egos with reality. Meanwhile, the weather began to turn. The golden days of summer faded into the chill of autumn. The men who had survived Normandy now faced new horrors. The Siegfried Line's concrete bunkers, the flooded plains of Holland, the bitter cold of the Ardennes. D-Day had been the beginning, but the road ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Still, for one shining moment, in that August of 1944, victory felt within reach. The shadow of occupation was lifting. Europe's heartbeat, stilled for 5 long years, began to pulse again. And for those who had come ashore on that terrible morning of June 6th, the thought was simple. We made it off the beach. We're still here. Let's finish this. If you're still with me, you're part of the few who really feel what these stories carry. The smell of smoke, the grit of sand, the weight of history. So if you haven't yet, subscribe now and share this video with someone who loves real stories. Not myths, not dramatizations, but the truth told with heart. Drop a comment below on which part of the D-Day aftermath you want me to cover next. Patton's charge, the Falaise trap in detail, or the liberation of Paris through the eyes of the resistance. All right, now imagine the grey light of dawn breaking over Normandy on June 6, 1944. The sea is calmer now, though streaked with wreckage, bodies, and the debris of war. The horizon glows faintly, and for the men still alive, it feels like they've lived a lifetime in just a few hours. Those who landed in the first wave have crawled through hell and come out the other side. Some without helmets, some without boots, some still trembling, clutching rifles that jammed from seawater but refusing to let go. The beach that looked impossible at 6 a.m. now belongs barely to the Allies. Omaha, Sword, Juno, Gold, Utah. 5 names that would soon be etched into history forever. But victory that morning didn't come easy, and it wasn't complete. It was still fragile, hanging by threads of courage, coordination, and plain stubbornness. When the first wave hit Omaha Beach, nearly everything went wrong. The tide was higher than expected. The bombers had missed most of the German defenses, and the tanks meant to provide cover had mostly sunk before even reaching shore. The men, many seasick, soaked, terrified, were mowed down before they could even find cover. Some died without ever firing a shot. And yet, somehow, by mid-morning, they began to push forward. Small groups of soldiers, engineers, infantry, medics started crawling up the beach, finding gaps in the barbed wire, clearing mines by hand, calling to one another over the deafening roar of machine guns. They weren't following orders anymore. They were surviving. The beaches farther east, Sword and Juno, where the British and Canadians landed, fared slightly better, though at enormous cost. At Juno, nearly half the first wave was cut down before reaching dry land. But the survivors pushed inland faster than any other force that day. By noon, they'd captured several key villages. At Sword, the British 3rd Division had fought through heavy resistance, linking up with French commandos under Lord Lovat. Imagine the sound of bagpipes echoing across the battlefield as Lovat's personal piper, Bill Millen, marched through gunfire playing the tune Highland Laddie. The Germans couldn't believe it. They didn't shoot him, thought he was mad. Maybe he was, but his pipes became a strange, surreal symbol of defiance that day. And at Utah Beach, the Americans had landed almost 2,000 yards off target, pure mistake. But luck, for once, was on their side. The area they hit was less defended than planned. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the president's son, made a snap decision. "We'll start the war from right here," he said. That kind of grit changed everything. By nightfall, Utah was secure. But let's not forget what was happening in the skies above. The airborne troops, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne. The British 6th Airborne had jumped hours before dawn, scattering across the French countryside. Many landed miles off course, in flooded fields, in trees, in German-held villages. Some drowned under the weight of their gear. Others dropped straight into enemy lines and fought tooth and nail to survive. There's a story I always loved about one young paratrooper who landed on a church roof in St. Mère-Église. The town was on fire, lit by flares and tracers, and as he hung from the steeple, tangled in his parachute lines, he watched helplessly as his comrades were shot below. He pretended to be dead for hours until the town was finally liberated the next day. You can still see that church today, with a parachute and dummy paratrooper hanging from it, a quiet reminder of that surreal night. Behind all this chaos was a staggering amount of planning, months, even years in the making. Operation Overlord wasn't just a military gamble. It was an engineering miracle. Consider the Mulberry Harbor's massive, floating artificial ports that the British designed and built in secret, towed across the channel, and assembled off the beaches to unload supplies. Once the landings succeeded, these harbors could handle thousands of tons of material daily: tanks, trucks, ammunition, food. Without them, the invasion would have stalled. The Allies knew that winning the first day was just the beginning. They'd need to keep hundreds of thousands of men fed, armed, and mobile on foreign soil for months. And then there were the Pluto pipeline, short for pipeline under the ocean. They carried fuel from England to France under the Channel. Another piece of quiet brilliance that few people ever think about. While men fought and died in the mud, engineers and sailors made sure the lifeblood of war fuel kept flowing. It's one of those details that reveals the hidden genius behind D-Day. Meanwhile, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, was away from the front that morning. He'd gone back to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday. Irony at its cruelest. He'd warned Hitler that the Allies would attack soon and argued that the beaches needed to be heavily fortified and defended right at the shoreline. But Hitler didn't listen. He believed the main invasion would come at Calais, farther north, and refused to release reserve forces when the news came in that Normandy was under attack. The German High Command was paralyzed by confusion, disbelief, and bureaucracy. For precious hours, they did nothing. That delay gave the Allies the breathing room they needed. By the end of June 6th, more than 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. The beaches were linked, but only just. The Germans were regrouping inland, preparing counterattacks. The real battle, the brutal, grinding push through hedgerows, towns, and farmlands, was only beginning. Normandy would become a battlefield unlike any other. Small villages turned into fortresses. fields divided by thick hedgerows that made tanks useless and ambushes constant. Every inch of progress was paid for in blood. You can picture it. The smoke, the ruined farmhouses, the sound of artillery echoing through the valleys, the air thick with the smell of cadite and earth. The young soldiers who had survived the beaches now found themselves crawling through bocage country, unsure where the next sniper or machine gun might be hiding. It was slow, punishing work. The glamour of the landings faded fast, replaced by exhaustion, fear, and mud. But still they pressed on, because turning back wasn't an option. It's easy now, looking back, to see D-Day as a single triumphant event, a clean victory. But for those who lived it, it was anything but clean. It was messy, chaotic, human. Thousands of mistakes, countless acts of courage, endless improvisation. A symphony of confusion somehow conducted toward victory. And among the unsung heroes were the medics. Those men who rushed into open fire to drag the wounded back. Some of them didn't even carry weapons. They marked themselves with red crosses and prayed the enemy respected the symbol. Many didn't. I remember reading one medic's diary. He wrote that the sound that haunted him most wasn't the shells or the machine guns, but the cries of men calling for their mothers as they bled out on the sand. That's the kind of thing history books rarely tell you, but it's the truth. Another thing most people forget is how international D-Day really was. Yes, it was largely an American and British operation, but men from all over the world took part: Canadians, Australians, Poles, Czechs, Norwegians, even a handful of free French soldiers who landed on their own soil for the first time in years. The invasion was more than a military operation. It was the embodiment of unity against tyranny. Different languages, different flags, one cause. By the third day, the Allies had established a firm beachhead. Supplies were pouring in, more divisions were landing, and the first makeshift airstrips were being built right on the beaches. Engineers worked around the clock under fire to make it happen. Those airstrips allowed Allied fighters and bombers to take off from Normandy, itself a game changer. It meant the front could move faster, with direct air support always overhead. Still, the Germans fought with ferocity. Their armored divisions, especially the SS Panzer units, were some of the most feared in the world. The Allies had air superiority, but on the ground, the fight was brutal. The town of Caen became a nightmare. Weeks of bombing and street fighting. The British called it a killing ground, but slowly, methodically, they broke through, you know. One of the most remarkable things about D-Day is how close it came to failing at several points. If the weather had turned worse, if the Germans had reacted faster, if the paratroopers had been scattered even further, the entire operation could have collapsed. It's hard to imagine how different the world might look today if that had happened. Sometimes history turns on luck as much as on bravery. And speaking of bravery, I want you to pause for a second and really imagine what those young men faced. 19, 20 years old, maybe younger. Many had never seen combat before. They weren't supermen, they were terrified. But they did it anyway. They climbed out of landing craft under fire. They carried their wounded friends. They pressed forward because the man next to them needed them too. That's what heroism truly is, not fearlessness, but action in spite of fear. Now, if you've been caught up in this story and want to keep traveling deeper into the heart of history with me, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who needs to feel what those men felt: the weight of courage, the cost of freedom. Leave a comment to tell me what moment from D-Day moves you most. I read everyone. Alright, now let's move into what happened next: the fierce push inland, the crumbling of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and how the world shifted forever in the weeks after June 6th. The days that followed D-Day were nothing short of grinding, relentless warfare. The beaches were behind them now, but ahead lay a maze of hedgerows, those ancient, thick earthen walls that divided the Norman countryside into 1,000 tiny fortresses. To the soldiers, they looked harmless at first. But when the first rifle shots cracked and the first tanks got stuck trying to push through them, they realized the Germans had turned nature into a weapon. Machine guns and mortars hid behind every line of brush. Every time the Allies thought they'd cleared a field, another burst of fire would cut through the leaves. It was slow, brutal, intimate fighting. You couldn't see the enemy until he was nearly close enough to touch. For weeks, the Allied advance crawled. The generals had planned to take the key city of Caen in a single day. It took over a month. The British and Canadians paid dearly for every block. Caen was flattened by bombing, yet German SS units refused to give it up. The Americans fought their own nightmare in the west, trying to capture Carentan and Saint-Lô. You can imagine the mud, the smoke, the sound of distant bombers that never seemed to stop. Sometimes the sky itself seemed to rumble endlessly, as though the entire earth was shaking with the effort of this war. And yet, something remarkable was happening. The German command was losing control. Their supply lines were in chaos, their reserves bogged down, and Allied air superiority was strangling their movements. Every daylight convoy was a target. Pilots in Thunderbolts, Typhoons, and Mustangs would strafe anything that moved: trucks, tanks, even lone motorcyclists. The Luftwaffe, once a terrifying force, was almost invisible over Normandy. The few German pilots who tried to engage were overwhelmed. The skies belonged to the Allies, and that meant the ground war would eventually follow. By mid-July, the Allies had poured over 1 million men into France. The beaches were bustling like industrial ports, now Mulberry harbors working day and night. Trucks rolling off ships in endless streams. Soldiers who had once crawled through sand under fire now watched convoys of reinforcements roll by and wondered how any of them had survived that first day. The sense of momentum was shifting. What had started as a desperate foothold was turning into a tide. But still, the countryside fought back. Every inch of Normandy had to be won, often more than once. One moment that's always stayed with me is the Battle of Hill 192, just outside Saint-Lô. It was one of those places that seemed meaningless on a map, but commanded the entire area. The Germans dug in deep tunnels, machine gun nests, overlapping fields of fire. When the Americans attacked, they used everything they had: artillery, air strikes, infantry assaults. The fighting was so close that men could hear the enemy breathing on the other side of the hedge. By the time it was over, Hill 192 was just a scarred mound of earth. But it opened the way for something bigger, Operation Cobra. Cobra was General Omar Bradley's plan to break out of the Norman bottleneck. On July 25, 1944, thousands of bombers darkened the sky. They dropped over 3,000 tons of explosives on a narrow strip of German defenses. The noise was beyond imagination, an unending thunder that shook the ground miles away. When it ended, an American soldier said the sky looked like it had been torn open. Entire divisions of German troops were simply erased. The survivors were dazed, deaf, crawling out of smoking craters. The Americans charged forward, tanks rolling through the gaps. At last, the stalemate broke. Normandy began to open up. But even victory came at a price. Some of those bombers, flying low and blind through the dust, accidentally dropped their payloads short. Dozens of American soldiers were killed by friendly fire. One of them was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the highest-ranking officers to die in combat. It's a cruel reminder that even the best-laid plans of war are written in chaos. After Cobra, the German lines collapsed fast. Allied armor poured through the breach, sweeping south and west, cutting off entire divisions. The Germans retreated toward Falaise, trying desperately to escape encirclement. What followed was the Falaise Pocketer slaughterhouse. Allied forces closed in from three sides, trapping tens of thousands of German troops. The roads were clogged with vehicles, wagons, horses, men running for their lives. Allied planes turned them into burning wrecks. The smell of death hung over that valley for weeks. Out of nearly 100,000 Germans in the pocket, only a fraction escaped. Normandy was finally secure. And then came the moment that changed everything: the liberation of Paris. The French resistance had risen inside the city, fighting German patrols, tearing down swastikas, reclaiming their streets. The Allies, cautious not to destroy the city with bombing, pushed in carefully. On August 25, 1944, French tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées. Crowds poured into the streets, cheering, crying, waving flags that had been hidden for long years. For the first time since 1940, Paris was free. General Charles de Gaulle marched proudly through the capital, declaring, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." Even the hardest soldiers felt their throats tighten that day. From there, the war in Western Europe became a race toward Germany. But let's not forget, D-Day wasn't just about the beaches. It was the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. Every battle after June 6th, every mile gained, every bridge taken, traced its roots back to that single morning when men charged through surf and fire to open the door to Europe. Without their courage, there would have been no Paris, no liberation, no victory. And yet, behind the triumphs, there were shadows. Normandy's civilian population paid a terrible price. Entire towns were flattened, thousands of families displaced or killed. All farmers came home to find their fields turned to craters, their cattle dead, their barns burnt to ashes. The people of Normandy bore it all with quiet dignity. Many welcomed the Allied soldiers with tears and bread, even as smoke still rose from their homes. That, too, was courage, the kind that doesn't wear a uniform dot as the Allies advanced. They discovered the true horror of what they were fighting against. The first concentration camps were liberated. The pictures that came out of those places changed the world forever. Suddenly, the abstract idea of fighting tyranny became something brutally real. The soldiers who had stormed the beaches now saw why it all mattered. Every friend lost, every step through the mud, every sleepless night, it all led to freeing those who had lived through the darkest side of humanity. Years later, when veterans talked about D-Day, they didn't boast. Most of them said they were just doing their job. They spoke more about the friends they'd lost than about medals or victories. One man said, "We weren't heroes. The heroes are the ones who never came home." You hear that often, and you realize how deep their humility ran. Even now, when you walk the beaches of Normandy, you can feel it, the ghosts of that day. The wind off the channel, the gulls crying overhead, the faint rustle of grass growing where men once fell. The sand hides fragments of metal and bone, washed by time but never forgotten. The sea looks peaceful, but it remembers. And above those beaches, row upon row of white crosses and stars of David stand in perfect silence. The Normandy American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer overlooks Omaha Beach like a guardian. If you ever visit, you'll see the names of thousands sons, brothers, fathers etched into marble. Some graves bear no names at all, just the words known only to God. Standing there, you can't help but feel small. You realize the freedom we take for granted was paid for by teenagers who never lived to see peace. That's why D-Day endures, not just as a military victory, but as a human story. A story of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when history demanded it. A story of fear overcome by duty, of chaos forged into courage. Every generation should hear it told not as a dry lesson, but as a living memory. Because the moment we forget what it cost to win that day, we risk losing what they fought for. So, if you've listened this far, if this story has stirred something in you, then honor them in the simplest way you can remember them. Share this story. Tell it to someone younger. Make sure the echo of their footsteps never fades. And while you're here, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what part of the D-Day story touches you most. Maybe it's the courage on Omaha, the bagpipes on Sword, or the silence of the cemetery today. Whatever it is, let's keep these memories alive together. Share this video with someone who loves history, because stories like this one deserve to be told again and again. And as we close this chapter, take one last look at those beaches in your mind. The waves rolling in, gentle now. The sand smooth and quiet. The same tide that once carried death now carries peace. The same sky that once rained steel now glows with sunset light. The world they dreamed of, our world, was born there, in blood and hope. That's the real legacy of D-Day. Not the victory alone, but the humanity that endured through it.